We ended off with a question, which was, how come after Moshe comes to Paroi and tells him Hashem's message to let the Jewish people go, things get worse? Because Hashem had already promised Moshe at the burning bush that I've heard the cries of the Jewish people. So that sounds like we're now activating the process of the redemption. The last thing that you'd expect is backtracking, that the wheels seem to come off. And somewhere inside the answer to that question, we'll discover what the theme is of the parasha. And once we understand what the theme of the parasha is, not the theme being the storyline, but the theme being the main lesson of the parasha. Once we have that information, then we'll be able to go back to the Haftarah and see how the Haftarah reflects that same theme, that same lesson. So, in order to answer the question why things got worse when Moshe went to Paroi, when you would have expected everything to begin to improve, and the plagues should have happened immediately, and the Jews should have been freed from slavery in no time. So we've got to ask ourselves, what's the long-term plan here? And unfortunately, so many people get this wrong. That's why, for example, people use the expression, they say, let my people go. Everybody extracts that out of the story, let my people go. Which really makes it sound like the whole objective over here is a civil rights movement. They're these people and they've been unjustly enslaved and they've been mistreated and they've been oppressed. So therefore the message is, let them go, that you have to allow them freedom because that is a basic human right. Now while that is technically correct, it's not what the verse says. It's not what Hashem's message is to Pharaoh. Because Hashem tells Moshe to tell Pharaoh very clearly, Shalach es ami, send my people. Not let my people go. Send my people. Now you know what's so important about making that distinction? When you use the expression, let my people go, the emphasis is, get them away from this open air prison. What happens next? Doesn't seem relevant. Whereas when you say, send my people, send indicates that there's a destination. This is not a free-for-all. It's not good enough to celebrate the fact that those who were previously oppressed as slaves are now free people. In fact, that's the mistake of most liberation movements. It's breaking free of oppression without a goal of where you're supposed to go once you've broken free. And if you don't have a destination, and you don't have an aspiration, then you have to anticipate that you're probably going to have chaos and anarchy, or the liberation movement is going to lose control and somebody else is going to step into the power vacuum. So it's really important for us to know that the message from Hashem is, send my people. And then there's another word, which always gets left out of the translation. Shalach es ami, send my people, ve'ya'avduni, so that they may serve me. So now you know the destination. The destination is, it's not good enough, and it's not even 50% of the way to redeem or to free the Jewish people from being slaves. That is meaningless until you have v'yavduni, until you have this commitment to serve Hashem. Now, where's that commitment going to manifest? At which point in the story will we reach the stage where the Jewish people are saying, okay, now we're committed to serve you, Hashem? It's not going to happen during the 10 plagues, even though technically as soon as the plagues begin, the Jews no longer are treated like slaves because the Egyptians are too busy dealing with one crisis after the next, so they can't manage the slaves. So technically they already have some degree of freedom at that point in time, but there's no question they haven't yet committed themselves to serve Hashem. At the time of the Exodus, when they physically leave Egypt, which is a massive thing because historically no slave had ever successfully escaped from Egypt, so this is a very big step and it's a revolution in terms of not only the Jewish experience but the global experience. At that point, they have freedom, but they haven't yet begun to serve Hashem. Even after the tremendous miracle of the splitting of the sea and the destruction of the Egyptian army, which leaves the Jewish people not only free, but without the threat of anybody chasing after them. So that's essentially, you could say, when the experience of leaving bondage or leaving slavery is now complete, they still haven't reached the point of serving Hashem. So where are they going to serve Hashem? when they get to Mount Sinai. And when they make that declaration, Naaseh v'nishma, we'll do whatever Hashem has to say, and you can fill in the details later, but right now we're committed. In other words, the goal, v'yavduni, the goal of taking the Jewish people out of Egypt is to get them to Mount Sinai. What's going to happen in Mount Sinai, that will define them as a Jewish nation. In other words, you could almost identify two steps in this process. Step number one is losing your slave status, which is very important because until you lose your slave status, that controls you and it defines you and you don't have the opportunity to become yourself. But it's all very well to lose the slave status. What's really important is to gain your new status, which is to become Hashem's nation. So that's going to happen at Sinai. And that's why the burning bush was actually on Sinai. The Midrash tells us that there was this lamb that ran away from the flock and Moshe had to chase after it, so it took him far away from where he had been shepherding, and he lands up at Mount Sinai. That's where the burning bush is. And that's why Hashem says to him that the sign of what this whole process of the Exodus is all about will be that the Jewish people will serve me al hahar hazeh, on this mountain. So right from the outset, Hashem's defined that the goal is to get us to Sinai, and at Sinai we'll receive the Torah, and at that point we'll become the chosen nation, which is what will be described in the parasha in 3 weeks' time. That will then be called a nation of priests and a holy people, etc. All of that's still to come. So that's going to happen at the time that we accept the Torah. So the pivotal moment in the development of the Jewish people is not so much the Exodus as much as it is the receiving of the Torah. And the Exodus is just to facilitate the possibility of receiving the Torah. Okay, so that's really important for us to know. So what's the whole story about? The story is about receiving the Torah and how that's going to affect us as a Jewish nation through the course of history. And to facilitate that, there is the Exodus. Now, that's a very different perspective to how most people understand it, because most people are so glad about the fact that the Jewish nation was liberated from being slaves, and that becomes the template for all liberation movements, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, that misses the point of what it is that we're trying to achieve over here, which is get us to Sinai so that we could commit to the Torah so we become a totally different nation. Now, the question is this. If the objective is to get us to Sinai, to receive the Torah, then we have to ask ourselves the question, what is this shift that's going to happen when we get the Torah compared to all of the traditions that these people had from their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents going all the way back to Abraham? What is going to be different about them now when they accept the Torah? Because we have a tradition, the Gemara tells us, that our forefathers observed the requirements of the Torah even before the Torah was given. So if they already observed those requirements, one of those requirements is to teach them to your children. So that implies that if Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov kept the Torah before it was a requirement, then they must have educated their children who educated their children to do those things as well. Now, we don't know to what extent the Jews as slaves in Egypt still kept those values, but we know that they knew of those values. And we know that there was the tribe of Levi who were exempt from slavery, and they lived with those values. So the question we've got to ask ourselves is, what changed? What's so different about the experience of observing the requirements of Torah before the Torah was given versus the experience of observing the Torah now that the Torah has been given? There's got to be a difference, right? So let's try and work out what the difference is. When Abraham, for example, we'll just use him as an example because he's the first. So when Abraham, for example, decides that he's going to keep a Pesach Seder. Now that's strange because Pesach hasn't happened yet. So in other words, he's observing a requirement of Judaism, even though the context hasn't yet become relevant. Now we know that he observed the Pesach Seder because we know that when the angels came to visit Abraham 3 days after he had his bris and he was in tremendous pain, so what does he tell Sarah to make for them? Ugois, which is round types of bread. And so based on that, the sages tell us that he was actually making matzah, that night was Pesach, and he was telling her to make matzah. So when Avraham makes matzah and eats matzah and has a Pesach Seder, where obviously he's not telling the story of the Exodus, because you can't tell the story of the Exodus, it hasn't happened yet. But let's say he's eating matzah on the night of Pesach. How does that compare to when we eat matzah on the night of Pesach in 2025? Or another example, And this example will give us a little bit more of a clue. So you remember that story about Yaakov when he was negotiating his salary with his father-in-law, and knowing that his father-in-law was such a dishonest man, he made a proposal which his father-in-law could not refuse, which was basically to say, I'll take all the mutated sheep. So you're going to keep, in your mind, you'd imagine the majority of the sheep, because I'm going to take the mutated ones. And Lavan is like, yes, of course. Gee, what an amazing deal. Absolutely. What does Yaakov do next? He effectively does the very first genetic engineering exercise in history, where during the mating season, he takes sticks and he impales them in the ground in different patterns, and somehow that influences the development of these new babies that are going to be born in the next season, and they all come out as these mutated sheep. Exactly what they had agreed upon. The spotted sheep and the speckled sheep and the sheep that have rings around their ankles, and this whole strange story of how Yaakov becomes a massively wealthy man on what everybody else would have thought was a terrible deal. So what's intriguing about that is the mystics say that when Yaakov was implanting those sticks in the ground, he fulfilled the same kind of thing that we fulfill when we put on tefillin. So how different are Yaakov's tefillin to our tefillin? Completely, right? Because Yaakov's tefillin were a bunch of sticks that he stuck in the ground. Now tefillin are these very specifically made cubes that have portions of the Torah inside of them attached to straps that we have to put on our arm and our head in a very specific fashion. So when we say that they observed the requirements of the Torah before the Torah was given, we have to acknowledge immediately that it was a very different experience to our experience. But it's not just a different experience in terms of what they did, it's a different experience, and this is the key, it's a different experience in terms of why they did it. In other words, what's better, and this is a trick question, what's better, to do the right thing because you were told to do so, or to do the right thing because you chose to do so? Which one's better?
When you choose.
When you choose, right? Everybody would expect that if you choose to do what is right, that must be better because it's come of your own insight and your own research or your own awareness, your own sensitivity. So surely that's a lot greater than when you've been told to do the right thing, right? That's what you'd think. And that is true in all human interactions. So for example, if you buy your wife flowers for Shabbos, that's a lot better than if she tells you to buy her flowers for Shabbos. That's in the human experience, when volunteer commitment has greater value than something that's been prescribed. That is not the case when it comes to our relationship with Hashem, for a very intriguing reason. When Avram decides that he's making matzah for Pesach, whose idea was that? His idea, right? He chose to do it because he's a very insightful person and he appreciates that there's going to be this festival called Pesach and it's going to be celebrated with matzahs. So because he's got this incredible insight into what's coming in the future, and because he's so spiritually in tune, so now he chooses to have matzah on Pesach, which is an incredible achievement that distinguishes Avraham from every other human on the planet at that time, because nobody else has that intuition, nobody else makes that choice, nobody else is invested in doing what Hashem will eventually want for us. So Avraham at that time in history is the most spectacular human that exists. Likewise, when Yaakov decides that he's going to manipulate whatever the process of tefillin is by putting these sticks into the ground, at that point, Yaakov is this unique human being. He's the only one on the planet who has that kind of spiritual intuition to know that this is what Hashem will expect of us. And therefore, he is flying at the highest spiritual altitude of anybody at that time in history. And because he's come forward and chosen to do so, he is the most developed spiritual person that exists. So the value of volunteering, the value of choosing to do the right thing, is the fact that obviously you're very invested in it and you obviously care about it, and it shows us who you are as a person. Which means that whatever the potential is for a human being to achieve, the highest level that a human being can develop to, these people have reached that through that experience, through their volunteering, through their choices. Can they get anywhere greater than their own potential? Obviously not. Doesn't make any sense. How can any person rise greater than their own potential? So Avraham is a very spiritual person, and a very wise person, and a very intuitive person. So therefore, he's got this great spiritual potential. And when he activates that spiritual potential by fulfilling the requirements of the Torah, he now reaches the peak of his potential. And the same happens to Yitzchak, and the same happens to Yaakov. In fact, not only can they reach the peak of their own potential, but theoretically, because of their efforts and because of their commitment, they could actually reach the highest levels of the whole creation's potential, because they are members of the created reality. And so therefore, if you really, really invest yourself, you could actually catapult yourself to the highest level of the created reality, which basically means that they could live, so to speak, out of this world. They could connect with the higher spiritual dimension, and they could be human on the planet living at a higher spiritual dimension. That's possible. You know what's not possible? It's not possible to achieve something that is outside of the created reality. That would make no sense. In the same way as a person can't climb into a box and then try to lift the box. It's not possible for a person to live in creation, in an existence that Hashem has defined, and then using their own efforts, believe that somehow they're going to be able to be greater than the forces of creation. That doesn't make any sense. But that will happen once Hashem gives us the Torah. Because the minute Hashem gives us the Torah, then it is no longer defined on our terms as humans. We're not the ones choosing to do these things. Hashem is the one prescribing these things, which means that Hashem is investing His perspective into the story. And Hashem's perspective is that there are no rules, and nothing is defined or confined by its potential or even by the reality in which it lives. In simple English, when Hashem gives us a mitzvah, it's an invitation to do something that can transcend our potential or could transcend the reality of the world. Now, if that sounds abstract, here's a great illustration. Yaakov has a spiritual experience using a bunch of sticks that he puts into the ground. His spiritual experience is similar to what we experience when we put on tefillin. And that's a very profound spiritual experience, and it affects his neshama very deeply. And as a result of that, Yaakov emerges as the most spiritual person on the planet at the time, reaching peak human spiritual potential. That's what happens to Yaakov. What happens to the sticks? Nothing. And as soon as the exercise is over, he leaves the sticks behind, or he throws them out, or he uses them in his fireplace. Because they have zero movement, nothing happens to the sticks. And that's because we're before the giving of the Torah, where the natural order is the reality of the world. And the natural order says spiritual things are spiritual, and physical things are physical, and there's no crossover. So you're a person with a soul, therefore you could have a spiritual experience. That's a stick. There's nothing it can do. It can't grow, it can't change, it can't shift. Once Hashem gives the Torah, because Hashem is beyond all of the rules, the definitions, and the confinement of reality, so Hashem can say, you know what, now I'm going to give you a mitzvah called tefillin. And what that mitzvah is going to do will be twofold. Number one, it's going to affect you. So you as a person who has a soul, and therefore spiritual potential, you're going to progress spiritually because you've done this exercise. But the object that you use for the exercise, which is a physical pair of tefillin made out of physical hide from a physical animal that really should have nothing to do with the spiritual world, those tefillin are going to become holy. You can't now just toss the tefillin into the dustbin after you've used them. They are holy objects. They have to be treated with respect. They have to be buried when they're no longer usable, because we're going to infuse holiness, godliness, infinity into finite physical things. That's what's going to change when the Torah is given. So, even though Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov did amazingly in terms of their own spiritual development, they hadn't yet been given the gift of doing something unnatural, something completely unexpected, something that still doesn't feel rational to us, which is why we often ask, well, does Hashem really care if it's 6:35 or 6:36 that Shabbos begins? Does Hashem really care if my tefillin are a little bit rounded on the corner, etc.? Because we still battle to get our heads around the idea that Hashem could squeeze infinity into such finite things. Now, you can't take people in their natural state as they were created, with all of their expectations, with hundreds of years of wiring and habituating how humans behave and how they think, and one day plonk them down in front of Mount Sinai and expect them to come out on the other side totally different people. That's not how it works. There's so many generations of conditioning where humans believe that the spiritual is spiritual and the physical is physical, and the two cannot collaborate. So either I'm going to be a great success story like Egypt that becomes a world empire, or I'm going to be a spiritual people who's going to always be downtrodden. You can't have both. So to get us to Sinai, Hashem has to do a reconstitution of the Jewish people. And that's very much like when you take a seed and you put it into the ground because you expect that something's going to grow. The first step to that growth is that the seed has to break. So the first step to Sinai is that the mold of who we are as a people and what we believed that our spiritual legacy is all about has to break. We can't keep any of the vestige of who we used to be, because the goal over here is that we're supposed to stand at Sinai not with all of our wisdom and all of our insight and all of our emotional maturity. We're supposed to stand at Sinai like simple children waiting for instructions, because what Hashem is about to give us is going to be so out of the ballpark, so unrelatable to anything that we already know, that if we come along with our old thinking process, we will not be able to get the message. So he kind of shatters us. That's why the Torah uses the expression, it calls Egypt the Kur HaBarzel, which means the iron cauldron. And the idea is that it's like taking a block of gold and melting it down so you can turn it into jewelry. That was the experience of the slavery. It's to break us down, so by the time we stand there at Sinai, we're not stuck in our old perspectives. We're now open to something which we have to accept without even understanding, which is do these things, and that will have this profound effect on you and on the world. So that's why right at the last moment, just when they're told it's time to leave Egypt, things don't automatically improve. They actually become more intense, because this is the breaking point. This is where they've reached, so to speak, that terminal velocity. You know, this is where they've reached this point where now the metal's going to melt. So they need that last push of intensity to shatter them completely, so when they stand at Mount Sinai, they are humbled and they're ready to accept what Hashem has to say, because the only way to connect with the Torah is through humility. That's not only something that has to happen to them, the world also has to shift. Because remember, this is not only that the Jews are going to change, the whole world is going to change. The world is now going to be invited into the spiritual experience. Up until this point, the physical world was excluded. And now it's going to be invited into the spiritual experience. So the world also has to crack and shatter. That's why the most powerful nation on earth, who is in a sense a representation of the whole physical world, has to be battered by these plagues, because that's going to break the world as we know it. Up until that point in time, what Egypt believed is what the rest of the world believed. So their whole outlook and their paganism and their belief in this, all their strange beliefs about death and, you know, the next world and killing slaves to be buried with their masters and all those kinds of things, the idea that it is acceptable to enslave other people, all of that's got to break. So you've got a parallel process happening here. The Jews, by being enslaved, and especially the last part of that slavery, which is so intense, are breaking from who they were to become open to hear what Hashem has to say. And the world, represented by Egypt, is being smashed by these plagues in order to break, so that the old system of how the world operated will no longer dictate how the world operates. So now the world is open to receiving the Torah and to changing. So what is the theme of the parasha? What is the lesson of the parasha? The lesson is how a person is appropriately placed to receive the Torah. And what sits at the core of that is the ability to lose our perspective in favor of Hashem's perspective. Just like Pharaoh says, I don't know Hashem, and Moshe's message to him is, now you will know Hashem. So it's all about losing our old perspective to gain a new perspective, which is to be aligned with what Hashem wants, even when it doesn't make sense to our brains. That's the theme of this parasha. And now we've got to see where that is in the Haftarah as well.